The oldest piece of paper in this county is about to ruin somebody's very confident morning, I said quietly as the sheriff's patrol truck rolled to a stop beside the gravel entrance, but nobody standing there understood what I meant. The warm Texas sun had already burned away the early morning haze, leaving the air thick with the smell of fresh-cut cedar and hot limestone. A gentle breeze carried the sound of wind chimes from a nearby porch, while the American flag outside the Willow Ridge clubhouse snapped sharply against its pole. Rebecca Collins stood beside a newly installed sign that read Private HOA Property in bold black letters, her arms folded with the unmistakable confidence of someone convinced the law had already chosen her side. Behind her, several board members gathered near the clubhouse entrance, whispering among themselves while curious homeowners slowed their morning walks to watch what they expected would become another simple removal of an unwanted visitor. I remained beside my dusty pickup truck without taking a single step toward the clubhouse. Resting across the passenger seat was an old brown leather document tube that had belonged to my grandfather for longer than I had been alive. The leather had faded with time, and the brass caps carried tiny scratches collected over decades of careful use. Rebecca noticed me glance toward it and smiled as though she believed it contained nothing important. She pointed directly at me when the sheriff climbed out of his truck. "That is the man," she announced before anyone asked a single question. "He has refused every request to leave HOA property." The sheriff adjusted his hat, walked toward us with calm professionalism, and looked first at Rebecca before turning to me. "Good morning, sir. I understand there has been some disagreement over this property." I nodded politely. "Good morning." Rebecca interrupted before I could continue. "He admitted he is not even a member of this association." The sheriff looked back at me. "Is that true?" "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "I am not a member." Rebecca lifted her chin with quiet satisfaction, believing the conversation had already ended. Several homeowners exchanged knowing looks as if they had just witnessed the final piece of evidence. One man folded his newspaper under his arm, while another quietly told his wife that the sheriff would probably have everything resolved within minutes. Nobody seemed interested in asking why I had returned 3 mornings in a row without raising my voice or arguing with anyone. Nobody wondered why I had never once challenged the temporary signs or the repeated warnings. The sheriff spoke again, his tone respectful but direct. "If you are not a member, may I ask why you are standing here today?" I looked toward the clubhouse instead of answering immediately. Sunlight reflected across its front windows, illuminating the freshly painted trim and stone walkway. Then I looked back at him. "Because this matter cannot be settled by opinions." Rebecca laughed softly. "Property ownership was settled years ago." I met her eyes for only a moment. "That depends on which documents you read." She shook her head dismissively. "Everything we need is already in the HOA records." I did not argue. I did not reach for the leather tube. I simply rested one hand on the edge of my truck and let the silence settle between us. The sheriff watched both of us carefully, sensing there was more to the story than either side had explained. Rebecca mistook that silence for hesitation. I knew it was patience. There is a difference. My grandfather used to tell me that people often trust the newest copy because it looks cleaner, newer, and easier to read, but the truth does not become less valuable simply because it grows older. That lesson had stayed with me for decades, and on that quiet morning it sat only a few feet away inside a weathered leather tube that nobody thought was worth opening. They believed they understood who belonged on that land. They believed the signs, the maps, and the assumptions were enough. None of them realized the only document that truly mattered had not yet been unrolled. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after my last sentence, and that silence carried me back more than 30 years to a different morning on the very same piece of land. My grandfather believed that every acre had a memory if someone cared enough to preserve it. He was not a lawyer, and he was certainly not a wealthy businessman. He was a surveyor who trusted steel measuring tapes, weathered boundary markers, and courthouse records more than rumors or confident opinions. When I was 8 years old, he took me to the county recorder's office for the first time instead of taking me fishing like most grandfathers probably would have. I remember the smell of old paper, polished wood counters, and coffee drifting through the quiet building while clerks carefully handled documents that were older than anyone standing in line. He placed one rough hand on my shoulder and pointed toward shelves filled with bound record books. He told me that land does not belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to whoever can prove ownership when every opinion disappears. I did not fully understand those words as a child, but I never forgot them. Years later, after college, I became a licensed land surveyor because I had seen too many property disputes begin with assumptions instead of facts. Every project started the same way. Before I stepped onto any parcel with my equipment, I started inside the courthouse, tracing every transfer, every easement, every recorded adjustment, and every original filing that explained how the property reached its current owner. It was slower than relying on modern summaries, but it prevented expensive mistakes. My grandfather used to smile whenever people complained that I was too thorough. He would simply say that shortcuts have a way of becoming detours. When he passed away, the only item he specifically instructed our family not to misplace was the old leather document tube resting inside his cedar cabinet. Inside it was the original deed for the family property, protected inside archival sleeves that he had replaced every few years. He had shown it to me dozens of times without ever allowing me to treat it like an ordinary piece of paper. He would carefully unroll it across the dining room table, smooth each corner with both hands, and explain every signature, every seal, every handwritten notation recorded by county officials decades before I was born. He never spoke dramatically about it. To him, preserving the original deed was no different from maintaining the foundation of a house. If you neglected it long enough, everything built above it could eventually shift. After inheriting responsibility for the property, I continued his routine without changing a single habit. Every year, I verified the public records against the original document stored in that leather tube. Every survey I completed confirmed the same legal boundaries my grandfather had shown me as a boy. That was why I remained completely calm while Rebecca confidently relied on copied neighborhood maps and recent association files. She believed age made a document less important. I had spent my entire career learning that sometimes the oldest record in the room was also the only one capable of ending an argument before it truly began. Rebecca Collins had lived in Willow Ridge long enough that very few people questioned anything she said. By the time I first met her, she had already served several terms as president of the Homeowners Association, and many residents spoke about her with a mixture of admiration and caution. She always arrived early for board meetings carrying a neatly organized binder filled with printed policies, color tabs, and neighborhood maps. She spoke clearly, confidently, and with the kind of certainty that made people assume every statement had already been verified somewhere. New homeowners often thanked her for keeping the neighborhood orderly, and longtime residents rarely challenged her decisions because doing so usually meant sitting through lengthy explanations about bylaws, architectural standards, and community procedures. Over time, confidence slowly became certainty, and certainty quietly transformed into assumption. I noticed that change the first week I drove through the neighborhood after inheriting responsibility for my family's property. Rebecca stopped her golf cart beside my truck before I had even stepped out. She smiled politely and welcomed me to the community, then immediately asked which address I owned. When I explained that I was inspecting land near the clubhouse, her expression shifted. Almost instantly, she informed me that the association controlled everything surrounding the building and suggested that I contact the management office before returning. I thanked her for the information without correcting her. There was no reason to begin an argument before I understood exactly what she believed. During the following 2 weeks, I visited the property several more times, always during daylight hours, carrying only a measuring notebook, a camera, and a small GPS receiver that I routinely used for survey work. Each visit revealed something new. Fresh landscaping had been installed several feet beyond the historical boundary markers. Decorative stones outlined walking paths that extended farther than older survey records indicated. A recently installed wooden sign welcomed residents onto what it described as exclusive association property, even though I quietly recognized one of the original iron boundary monuments sitting only a short distance away beneath a patch of tall grass. Nobody else seemed to notice it. Rebecca certainly did not. Every conversation followed nearly the same pattern. She quoted association rules. I listened. She pointed toward neighborhood maps posted inside the clubhouse. I nodded respectfully. She reminded me that the board had managed the property for years. I simply thanked her and returned to my truck. Several homeowners began recognizing me as the quiet man who never argued. Some probably assumed I realized I was mistaken and simply needed time to accept it. Others watched with curiosity because they could sense there was something unusual about how calmly I responded whenever Rebecca insisted the matter had already been settled. What none of them knew was that every evening after leaving Willow Ridge, I stopped by the county recorder's office or reviewed archived survey records that confirmed exactly what my grandfather had spent decades preserving. Every document I verified strengthened the same conclusion. The original legal boundary had never changed. The recorded ownership had never transferred. The only thing that had changed over the years was the confidence with which people repeated information that had never been carefully checked. Rebecca believed repetition created truth. My grandfather had taught me that truth survives whether anyone repeats it or not. Standing outside the clubhouse that morning, watching Rebecca confidently explain the situation to the sheriff, I realized she genuinely believed she was protecting community property. She simply had never imagined that the oldest document connected to Willow Ridge was still resting inside the weathered leather tube on the passenger seat of my truck, waiting for the first person willing to read it carefully. The sheriff listened without interrupting while Rebecca confidently explained the situation as though every important question had already been answered before he arrived. She opened her binder, flipped through several neatly organized pages, and pointed to a laminated neighborhood map that showed the clubhouse surrounded by land highlighted in bright green. From several feet away, it looked official enough to satisfy almost anyone. She explained that the association had maintained the landscaping, repaired the sidewalks, replaced the irrigation system, and supervised every improvement around the building for years. Each sentence sounded reasonable because much of it was true. The association had maintained the area. Volunteers had planted flowers every spring. Contractors hired by the board had resurfaced the parking lot and trimmed the oak trees. None of those facts, however, answered the only question that actually mattered. Maintenance and ownership were not the same thing. I had learned that lesson long before I earned my surveying license, and I quietly wondered how many people confused the two without ever realizing the difference. The sheriff accepted the binder politely and studied the map for several moments before looking toward me again. His expression remained professional, neither agreeing with Rebecca nor questioning my presence. He simply wanted enough information to understand why he had been called. Rebecca interpreted his silence as agreement. She folded her arms once more and spoke with even greater confidence. She explained that I had appeared several mornings in a row, taken photographs, written notes, and walked near what she described as restricted association property without authorization. She emphasized that I had admitted I was not a member of the homeowners association, repeating those words as though they settled every remaining issue. Several residents standing nearby nodded in quiet agreement. From their perspective, everything fit together perfectly. An unfamiliar man kept returning to property managed by the association while openly admitting he did not belong to it. I understood why they reached that conclusion. What they did not know was that every photograph I had taken included an original boundary monument hidden beneath grass or landscaping installed years after the neighborhood was built. Every note inside my field book matched measurements confirmed by county survey records. Every visit had been carefully planned, not because I expected an argument, but because I knew careful documentation always mattered more than emotional reactions. Rebecca reached into another section of her binder and produced copies of warning letters that had been mailed to my home during the previous week. She explained that I had ignored every request to stop entering the area. She was correct about one thing. I had not responded. There was nothing useful to gain from exchanging letters based on assumptions. My attorney had advised me that if the disagreement continued to escalate, facts would eventually become more valuable than opinions. Standing beside my truck, I remembered those words while listening to Rebecca describe me as stubborn, uncooperative, and unwilling to respect community rules. I felt no anger toward her because I genuinely believed she thought she was protecting neighborhood property. Confidence built upon incomplete information often looks exactly like certainty until someone places better evidence on the table. The sheriff closed the binder and handed it back to Rebecca with a courteous thank you. Then he turned toward me once more. His voice remained calm and respectful as he asked a simple question that changed the direction of the entire morning. "Sir, before we go any further, Is there any documentation that explains why you believe you have the right to be here? I looked through the windshield toward the weathered leather document tube resting across the passenger seat. The brass cap reflected a narrow beam of sunlight, and for the first time that morning I reached for the truck door handle without saying a single word. The truck door opened with the familiar sound of worn hinges, and every pair of eyes followed my movement as though they expected me to pull out some recent permit or a membership application that would somehow explain everything. Instead, I reached across the passenger seat with both hands and carefully lifted the old leather document tube. It was heavier than it looked because its brass fittings had been made to last for generations rather than decades. Dust caught the sunlight as I brushed the surface with my sleeve, revealing the darker brown leather beneath. Rebecca glanced at the tube and gave a quiet laugh. "If that is an old family keepsake, it is not going to change who owns this property," she said with complete confidence. I looked at her for a moment without responding. My grandfather had often reminded me that the value of evidence never depended on whether people respected it before seeing it. The sheriff remained patient. He did not rush me or encourage either side to speak over the other. He simply waited, understanding that calm conversations usually revealed more truth than hurried arguments. Before opening the tube, I placed it carefully across the tailgate of my truck. The brass cap required 2 full turns before it loosened with a soft metallic click. Several homeowners leaned forward slightly, curious now that something unexpected was finally happening. I slowly removed a protective cloth that had wrapped the contents for years. Beneath it rested several carefully preserved documents inside clear archival sleeves. Their edges had faded with age, but every page remained flat, clean, and remarkably well protected. Rebecca folded her arms again. "Those cannot possibly be current records," she said. "Everything important is digital now." I smiled politely because I had heard that assumption many times during my career. Digital records were valuable, but they were only as accurate as the documents from which they had been created. Originals still mattered. I removed only the first sleeve without allowing anyone close enough to read it. The sheriff noticed the raised county seal pressed into the paper and the handwritten signatures preserved beneath it. His expression became more attentive, although he made no conclusions. "May I examine those?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. "That is exactly why I brought them." Before handing over the document, I explained that the originals had remained in my family since my grandfather received them after the property transfer many decades earlier. Every year I compared them against the county records to ensure nothing had been altered or overlooked. Rebecca interrupted before the sheriff could respond. She insisted that the association's files had already been reviewed countless times and that every improvement around the clubhouse had been approved through proper channels. I agreed with her on that point. Improvements could certainly be approved. Maintenance could certainly be performed. None of that automatically transferred ownership. The distinction seemed small until a disagreement required someone to prove where one legal right ended and another began. The sheriff accepted the first document with both hands, treating it with the same care I had used while removing it from the tube. He glanced briefly at the embossed seal before looking back at me. "I would like to read this carefully," he said. "Please do," I answered. "Because the first page is only the beginning. The document everyone has been relying on is a copy. What you are holding is the record from which that copy was created, and there are additional pages that almost nobody has looked at in decades." Rebecca's confident expression remained unchanged, but for the first time that morning she stopped speaking. Even the breeze seemed quieter as the sheriff lowered his eyes toward the faded paper and began reading the opening lines with deliberate care. The sheriff read the first page without saying a word, and the quiet that settled over the parking lot felt heavier than any argument Rebecca had made that morning. I watched his eyes move carefully across each line, instead of skimming the document the way most people read modern paperwork. He paused at the embossed county seal, examined the recording information, and then turned the page with deliberate care. The breeze rustled through the live oak branches above us, scattering a few dry leaves across the sidewalk, while nobody standing nearby seemed willing to interrupt his concentration. Rebecca shifted her weight from one foot to the other and finally broke the silence. She assured him that the association had complete records showing the clubhouse grounds had always been maintained by the board. The sheriff acknowledged her statement with a polite nod, but continued reading without offering an opinion. I remained beside the tailgate, keeping the remaining documents inside their protective sleeves. My grandfather had always insisted that patience was part of protecting important records. There was no benefit in rushing someone who was finally looking at the right evidence. After another minute, the sheriff looked up. His expression had not become dramatic, but it had clearly become more thoughtful. He asked whether there were additional pages connected to the recorded deed. I handed him the next archival sleeve, followed by a certified boundary survey completed decades earlier and a later county survey that referenced the same legal description without changing its property lines. He compared the parcel numbers carefully, tracing the legal description with one finger before looking toward the clubhouse and then back to the documents. Rebecca stepped closer and pointed toward the laminated neighborhood map inside her binder, explaining that the association had relied on those boundaries for years. The sheriff thanked her, then placed the binder beside the original deed so he could compare both sources side by side. Several homeowners leaned forward, trying to understand what he was seeing. From where they stood, both documents appeared official. The difference was not immediately obvious unless someone understood how recorded property history worked. The sheriff finally spoke in the measured tone of someone choosing his words carefully. He explained that the original deed and the accompanying county survey appeared to identify the parcel differently from the association map. He emphasized that he was not making a final legal determination at the roadside, but he also could not ignore officially recorded documents that appeared consistent with one another. Rebecca immediately insisted there had to be a mistake because the clubhouse had been managed by the association for as long as anyone could remember. I understood why she believed that. Years of uninterrupted maintenance can create a powerful impression, but impressions are not recorded transfers of ownership. The sheriff asked whether I would object if he contacted the county survey office to verify the parcel information directly. I answered that I would welcome it because independent verification was exactly what my grandfather had taught me to respect. He stepped a short distance away, made the call, and quietly read the parcel identification numbers exactly as they appeared on the original deed. While we waited, nobody spoke very much. Even Rebecca seemed less certain than she had been only a few minutes earlier. The confidence that had filled the morning was gradually giving way to careful observation. About 10 minutes later, the sheriff's radio crackled with a response requesting that he compare one additional recording reference listed near the bottom of the second page. I looked at the faded ink, smiled to myself, and realized that the overlooked notation my grandfather had pointed out years ago was finally about to become the most important line anyone at Willow Ridge had read in decades. The sheriff read the recording reference from the bottom of the second page into his radio one more time, speaking slowly enough that every number and every letter could be verified without confusion. The reply did not come immediately. During the next few minutes, the only sounds were the rustling leaves, the distant hum of lawn equipment somewhere across the neighborhood, and the occasional chirping of birds settling onto the clubhouse roof. Rebecca tried to restart the conversation by explaining that the association had insured the clubhouse grounds, approved landscaping contracts, and budgeted for maintenance every year since she joined the board. Nobody questioned those facts. They simply no longer answered the question that everyone now realized mattered most. The sheriff finally lowered his radio and looked toward me with the same calm professionalism he had shown since arriving. He explained that the county office had located the recording reference exactly where the original deed indicated it would be. More importantly, the archived records appeared to match the legal description contained in my family's original documents. He carefully emphasized that only the appropriate county offices could make final administrative determinations regarding property records, but based on the documentation available, he had no basis to order me to leave the location. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. She immediately opened her binder again and searched through page after page, flipping faster with each passing second, as if another copy of the neighborhood map might somehow produce a different answer. One of the other board members quietly stepped closer and looked over her shoulder. The confidence that had filled the parking lot earlier that morning slowly gave way to uncertainty. I reached into the leather tube once more and removed the final document my grandfather had always described as the page people forgot to read. It was a certified survey prepared after the original transfer, referencing the same parcel boundaries while identifying the exact location of the iron monuments still buried beneath the newer landscaping. I handed it to the sheriff, who compared its measurements with the earlier survey and nodded thoughtfully. He then walked with me several yards away from the clubhouse to the area where I had photographed the old boundary marker during my previous visits. Brushing aside a thin layer of soil and grass with the toe of his boot, he exposed the top of the weathered iron monument exactly where the survey indicated it should be. He did not make a dramatic announcement. He simply compared its location with the certified measurements and quietly acknowledged that the physical monument appeared consistent with the recorded documents. Rebecca watched from several yards away without saying anything. For the first time since I had met her, she looked less certain of the maps inside her binder than the evidence resting on the ground in front of her. The sheriff returned the original deed and every supporting document to me with obvious care, thanking me for preserving them so well. He explained to everyone present that disagreements over property boundaries were matters best resolved through official land records and the appropriate county processes rather than assumptions based on maintenance history or neighborhood practice. No accusations were made. No raised voices filled the air. The facts had simply become impossible to ignore. As I carefully rolled each document back into its protective sleeves and returned them to the old leather tube, I remembered my grandfather's quiet smile whenever he finished reviewing those same pages at our dining room table. He used to tell me that the truth rarely needed an audience. It only needed someone willing to read every line before deciding what belonged to whom. And that morning, after decades of being quietly preserved, those forgotten lines had finally spoken for themselves. The parking lot slowly emptied after the sheriff returned to his patrol truck, but the questions he left behind continued spreading through Willow Ridge faster than any official notice ever could. By that afternoon, homeowners who had quietly watched the conversation began comparing what they had witnessed with what they had believed for years. Several neighbors stopped me before I reached the main road, not to argue, but to ask whether the original deed was truly that different from the copies the association had been using. I explained that the difference was not dramatic at first glance. The legal descriptions looked remarkably similar until someone followed every recording reference from beginning to end. That was exactly why my grandfather insisted no document should ever be separated from the records connected to it. A missing reference could change the understanding of an entire property history. During the following week, the board scheduled a special meeting open to every homeowner in the community. I attended only because several residents personally invited me to explain how recorded surveys and original deeds work together. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse felt completely different from every previous visit. Instead of assuming the outcome before the discussion began, people arrived carrying notebooks, printed county records, and genuine questions. Rebecca sat quietly near the front of the room with the same binder she had confidently relied upon only days earlier. This time, however, additional documents rested beside it, including copies of the county records obtained after the sheriff's verification request. An attorney representing the association explained that the board had begun reviewing decades of archived files after discovering that some internal reference maps had been simplified over the years for administrative convenience rather than legal interpretation. Those simplified maps had gradually become the versions everyone relied upon, while the underlying recorded property documents received less attention with each passing board election. Nobody accused previous volunteers of acting in bad faith. Instead, the discussion focused on how easily assumptions could survive when nobody revisited the original sources. When my turn came to speak, I placed the leather document tube on the meeting table but did not immediately remove the deed. Instead, I explained that preserving historical records was never about winning disagreements. It was about preventing honest mistakes from becoming permanent misunderstandings. I demonstrated how the parcel identification numbers connected one recorded document to another until the complete ownership history became impossible to misunderstand. Several homeowners admitted they had never realized that maintenance responsibilities, insurance obligations, easements, and legal ownership could exist independently of one another. They had naturally assumed that caring for the land also meant owning it. By the end of the evening, the association voted to commission an independent review of every property map used in its governing records so future boards would rely on documents fully consistent with the county archives. Rebecca eventually stood and addressed the room. She acknowledged that she had trusted the association's internal files without independently tracing every recorded reference back to its original source. She thanked the residents for supporting a complete review rather than continuing the disagreement. Her words were calm and sincere, and they seemed to ease the tension that had divided neighbors throughout the week. As the meeting concluded, several homeowners gathered around the old leather tube with quiet curiosity. They expected to see an extraordinary document capable of changing everything. I gently smiled because the paper itself looked surprisingly ordinary. The real difference had never been its appearance. Its value came from the uninterrupted chain of recorded truth it preserved, patiently waiting for someone willing to read beyond the newest copy and all the way back to the beginning. Nearly a year passed before I parked my truck beside the clubhouse again, and the first thing I noticed was not what had changed, but what had disappeared. The temporary signs claiming ownership beyond the recorded boundary were gone. The landscaping still looked beautiful, the sidewalks remained clean, and children still rode their bicycles through the neighborhood on warm Saturday mornings. But now every improvement rested within clearly documented property lines that matched the county records instead of outdated assumptions. Willow Ridge had not become a different community. It had simply become a more careful one. The association completed its independent review and updated every property map used in future meetings, making certain each version matched the official county archives. Homeowners who had never paid much attention to legal descriptions began asking thoughtful questions before approving future projects, and the board adopted a policy requiring recorded documents to be verified whenever questions about property boundaries arose. Rebecca remained in the neighborhood for several months after the review concluded, although she chose not to seek another term as president. The last conversation we shared surprised me because there was no disagreement left between us. She admitted that years of relying on familiar files had slowly convinced her that repeated information automatically became unquestionable truth. I told her that almost everyone eventually falls into that habit. Experience is valuable, but experience should always leave room for verification. She nodded thoughtfully before wishing me well, and we parted with mutual respect instead of resentment. A few weeks later, I visited my grandfather's old house to finish organizing several family keepsakes that had remained untouched since his passing. The cedar cabinet still stood in the corner of the study exactly where he had left it years earlier. Sunlight filtered through the window, filling the room with the familiar scent of aged wood and old books. I unlocked the cabinet, lifted the weathered leather document tube from its shelf, and carefully unrolled the original deed across the same dining room table where he had patiently explained every signature, every recording reference, and every handwritten notation when I was a child. The paper looked no more impressive than it had the first time I saw it decades earlier. It was still slightly yellow with age. The embossed seal remained crisp beneath my fingertips. The ink had faded just enough to remind me that time changes appearances far more quickly than it changes the truth. I smiled as I remembered my grandfather's favorite lesson, one he repeated so often that I could still hear his voice whenever I opened the document. He always said that people spend too much energy trying to win arguments and not enough time understanding the records that settle them. Looking back, I realized the most important moment of that entire experience was not when the sheriff read the deed or when the county confirmed the recording references. The real turning point happened the instant everyone stopped defending assumptions and started examining evidence together. That simple decision transformed conflict into understanding without anyone needing to raise a voice. Before leaving, I carefully returned every page to its protective sleeve, rolled the documents back into the old leather tube, and placed it inside the cedar cabinet once again. It had rested there through changing owners, changing boards, changing maps, and changing opinions, quietly preserving the same recorded truth year after year. In the end, the loudest claims faded, the newest copies were corrected, and the oldest piece of paper in the room proved exactly what my grandfather had taught me all along. Truth does not become stronger because people believe it. Truth simply waits for someone willing to read every line.